Welcome back to Outreach with Reggie. I'm your host, Reggie Holloway. And if you've been with me through season one, thank you so much because you've shown up, you've listened, and you have grown with me throughout every step of the way. Today, we close this chapter with an episode that connects everything we've discussed: how movements evolve, how presence becomes power, how protest becomes policy. This episode is called From Protest to Policy because marching is essential, but lasting change happens when we enter the rooms, craft the laws, and hold systems accountable. So without further ado, let's get into it. Before we even mention the word policy and all of the things that go into that, I want to honor, because we must honor, the power of protest, the power of its urgency, the power of the voices being used, the power of it fully as its role is the ignition, it's the starter, it's the engine, it's the call to action, it's the spark to what we aim to speak about and what we aim to do. For numbers wise, in the U.S. during the summer of 2020, from May to August, as COVID was happening, more than 10,000 demonstrations of protest or demonstration events were recorded across the country. Of those, nearly 95% involved peaceful protesters, and less than 5% involved violence, meaning that as media will display, or media may sway you to believe that, there violence and attacks, and there were attacks, and I do not want to go against or be absent-minded that people were harmed, because I would do that a disjustice. But I will say, due to the numbers and the statistics, protest is overwhelmingly non-violent by the numbers, because it's a civic act, not chaos. Think about recent mass mobilizations. The No Kings protests earlier this year reportedly drew 4 to 6 million people across more than 2,000 U.S. cities, one of the largest coordinated protest days ever. That represents 1 to 2% of the U.S. population. And in 2025's hands-off protest in over 1,400 locations across all 50 states, people rallied against policies of the Trump administration and the mosque-led shifts. Scholars are also pointing to the 3.5% rule, the idea when 3.5% of a population actively mobilizes, they can force major changes. In the U.S., that is about 12 million people. Some of those recent mass protests approached or exceeded that threshold, which shows the potential for protests to drive real policy influence. Protests reflect wider public sentiment. A Brooks analysis finds that recent protests mirror growing public discontent over budget cuts, layoffs, inequality, and violations of legal norms. Now, to bring it more of a personal and get away from the numbers a little bit, I think back to when I had the opportunity to moderate for a program that I did with Karen Greer and Donna Lowry, two amazing people, but also two people that are very big news anchors. I apologize. And we talked about racial injustice, and we talked about how we were able to interview people like Killer Mike, the Fulton County DA, two of those Morehouse and Spelman students that were tased during the riots that happened here in Atlanta. And that's what led me to want to become not only a youth advocate, but someone who wanted to be a conduit of change, but not knowing how right away, but thankful for the opportunity because it felt like a rush. It felt like something I needed to be a part of. So when the opportunity came and they offered it to me, I jumped right at it. But just hearing the stories of what they went through and, of course, asking the questions that were docket to ask, but just to necessarily need to ask those questions and engage in those conversations to see how we can not only talk about fostering a connection to see the disconnect between police officers and people who are connected to these communities that we're a part of, our communities. What's the disconnect between during that time and even right now? Because when you carry a sign, you bring your voice, you walk into these streets, but many times after the march, fatigue sets in. The question is, what's next? That's what this episode's about. What's next? Where do you go from here? Before I go into the next segment, I'm going to tap into something else. I remember when the Black Lives Matter was all around the world, murals, writings on streets, all around, because people were tired of seeing the same thing: pain, killing, murder on camera, news outlets spreading it around like it's wildfire and entertainment, much to the point where I remember sitting at the cafe hall while in college, and I remember seeing the verdict. People were holding trash bins. And people were nervous because we didn't know the verdict of those cases, if there was going to be justice that day or if there wasn't. I also remember when Black Lives Matter, the organization, where it was disclosed that the funds that were allocated to this organization were used improperly. I remember a lot of people saying, I guess, well, Black lives don't matter anymore, or people just lost hope in the organization and they tied the organization to the movement of what Black Lives Matter meant to a lot of people. And it became fuel or talking points to laugh at or to interject and say, well, Black lives couldn't have mattered if the money wasn't used the proper way. I even remember seeing a clip during this time where, as the world illustrated Black Lives Mattered, and they screamed it because at that time people were so fed up. I remember seeing the video saying, what's next? How do we go from here? And that's what I want to talk about in the next segment, so stay tuned. When we talk about what's next, the transition, right? Turning protest, the calls to action, speaking out, making this known that we disagree with the current state of what's going on. That is turning protest into policy and discussion. So as I list a few pointers, I would advise you to stay with me, or at least kindly ask. So number one, strategy and organization behind the scenes. Protest make demands. Policy work translates those demands into actionable legislative language. It's the bridge. It's how we connect the problems through the people the problems the people state, into who we vote for, who we've put in the office using our voting power, who we trust in because every 2 to 4 years they ask for us to trust them to serve us as a representation in government. And it's not glamorous. It's meetings with legislators, drafting proposals, coalition work, budget negotiations, subcommittee hearings, and stakeholder management. An example of this was the March on Washington in 1963 that wasn't just symbolic. It played a key role in building pressure towards the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Affordable housing movements in cities often began with protest or tenant organizing, then shift to pushing city ordinances and zoning changes. The second thing is building capacity in infrastructure. Movements that last invest in training organizers, building research capabilities, establishing legal teams, doing policy analysis, and engaging in civic education. In Atlanta, for instance, the Center of Civic Innovation works to make data, legislative processes, and budgets more accessible, helping residents engage in research, advocacy, and policy design. The Georgia Center of Civic Engagement invests in youth civics education and hands-on participation to build a strong foundation for civic power. Third step, coalition and alliance building. Policies rarely, and I mean rarely, changes via a single actor. You need coalitions, community groups, nonprofits, faith leaders, business stakeholders, and legal partners to make these things happen. For example, Advancing Justice is an organization through Atlanta that organizes on immigrant rights, racial justice, LGBTQ plus issues. They combine grassroots organizing with policy advocacy. Another one is the Latino Community Fund of Georgia, or LCF Georgia, that is working in Georgia on legislative and grassroots advocacy for their communities. Galileo focused on civic engagement and leadership in Georgia's Latinx community. Also, the Georgia Equality is the statewide LGBTQ rights group. They do policy advocacy, legal work, and community engagement in Georgia. The fourth one I'm going to talk about is advocacy, oversight, and accountability. After a law passes or is defeated, movements need to ensure implementation, accountability, and oversight. That is where watchdogs, audits, and civic pressure matter. Movements often track metrics. For example, how funds are spent, what enforcements look like, gaps in implementation, and things of that matter. So when we see bills that are not passed or bills that we're trying to do legislation that is not tended to right away, those are the moments where we have to have those watchdogs, audits, and civic pressure to keep those who we put into power accountable. For this next segment, I am going to provide some stories from the ground coming up. So stay tuned for more. Now, I'm going to provide some ways or just give you examples of people in Georgia and beyond who have lived the protest to policy path. There are people that go through the Atlanta Tenant Coalition. For example, there was one organizer in Atlanta that began by attending Tenant rallies over evictions and rent hikes. Over time, they joined the city's housing task force, presented data over rent burdens, and helped draft the tenant protection ordinance. And because of the pressure from the protests, advocacy groups, and coalition partners, the city adopted a first time right to counsel pilot for tenants facing eviction. Another story is the New Georgia Project that works year round in Georgia to register underrepresented voters, that being Black, Latinx, young people in marginalized communities, and engage in them politically. They don't just wait for election cycles. They organize in off cycles, tracking local legislation, coach community leaders to speak in hearings, and host trainings. NGP's approach is a bridge from civic engagement to influencing policy. Another one is Women Engaged, co-founded by Malika Redmond, centers women of color in Georgia, leadership, civic engagement, and policy advocacy. They run nonpartisan voter engagement, community-based advocacy, and policy education, focusing on things like maternal health, economic equity, and voting justice. They show how a focused, community-rooted organization can push for specific policy change while maintaining mass engagement. Let's zoom out and see what the data says about activism, civic engagement, and the power dynamics nationally. According to research from Pew, 53% of U.S. adults who voted say that they engaged in at least one of six political activities in the prior 6 months. That being contacting officials, attending meetings, etc., etc. That shows many people see themselves as politically engaged beyond just voting or just watching TV, the news, or going on social media and seeing the news breaks and whatnot. They're actively engaged in what's going on politically. Gen Z is also showing up, that being around 32% of Gen Zers say that they regularly engage in activism or social justice work. Among college students, that number rises to almost 40%. Over half of Gen Zers, that being 51%, have participated in rallies or protests. Among those in higher education, that is 56%. Historically speaking, to put it in context, protesters have grown. Between 2009 and 2019, mass protests increased annually by 11.5%. The science of protest underscores that coordinated multi-site protests have a higher chance of pushing public attention, media coverage, and provoke political response. And globally, the Carnegie Global Protest Tracker shows protests remain a key lever of accountable governance across the world. Now, we can look at the numbers all day, and I mean all day. But all this data tells us, all of it just tells us something's obvious. People want to be heard, and these issues must be seen. But hearing alone doesn't change systems. Let me say it again. Hearing alone doesn't change systems. We need to channel that energy with strategy, policy, and sustained engagement. One of the things I want this finale to be is actionable. So here in Georgia, in national organizations, I'm going to share with you so you can now join in. or at least get connected with, or at least be able to share these resources, these organizations, and pass it along. Use these organizations, use these resources to share, make impact, or even join. So here we go. New Georgia Project, register voters, engage in activity, advocacy, and build political power across Georgia. Advancing Justice in Atlanta. Join their civic engagement, organizing and leadership training efforts. Latino Community Fund Georgia, or LCF Georgia, working with them on legislative and grassroots advocacy locally. Galileo, civic engagement and leadership for Georgia's Latinx community. Georgia Equality, advocacy for LGBTQ plus rights in Georgia. Hands on Atlanta, while more volunteer service oriented, great for building community ties and meeting local nonprofits. Civic Georgia, they amplify community led efforts across the state. Georgia Center for Civic Engagement, especially useful if you care about civic education, youth engagement, and building long-term civic infrastructure. Now we talk about our national and broader organizations. Indivisible, thousands of local chapters doing legislative pressure, organizing, and movement strategies across the U.S. Recently reemerged strongly. Points of Light, civic engagement and volunteerism network based in Georgia but with national reach. Women Engaged works at the intersection of women's leadership, racial justice, and civic engagement. Georgia-based but with influence/adoption strategies. 9 to 5 GA. They do voting rights, registration, and civic campaigns in Georgia. The Fuller Center for Housing. Faith and community-based housing advocacy and repair across the U.S., especially Georgia. Georgia's 4-H for young audiences developing leadership, citizenship, and service mindset. So, within all of those organizations, both locally and nationally, if you are listening and don't know where to start, just pick one local and one national group here. Reach out, see how you can volunteer, get on their email list and attend a meeting. Even small commitments build muscle, because policy change is a marathon, not a sprint. Now, let's talk tactics. How can you turn passion into impact? Well, here's a few that I can give you. Track legislation. Find out what your city, county, or state is debating. Use resources. Many local civic sites provide bill trackers. Another thing you can do is attend public hearings and meetings. City council, school board, and many other things. Speak if you can at those meetings. Join or form issue-based coalitions, whether around housing, education, policing, environment. Collective voice is louder. Volunteer or intern with organizations doing long-term work. Use your vote. Local elections matter. Local elections matter. Support oversight and accountability. Audit committees. FOIA request. Community monitoring. Educate others. Host listening sessions. Teach neighbors how to engage. Use your social media. Create a podcast. These are small acts that added over time, shift power. Now, before I close, I want to reflect on what this season has meant to me. I created this podcast at a time where I was working at a job and I didn't love it. It was tearing me limb from limb. It ruined um, me at my core. But I wanted to do this because I thought about doing this years ago because I wanted to see how can I change the world in a crazy way. But not in a crazy way, but just in a way that I knew what I had in me. I knew what fire I wanted to do. And I got in, as we engage in media day to day, I wanted to create a spark, not just talk about and complain or be worrisome about the things that was going on in the world. And it's okay to be worrisome, but I wanted to channel that and see how can how can I at least influence others to say, how do we go from here? Because I can't just walk away. Over these episodes, we've talked about presence, identity, leadership, movement building, systems, story, and power. My hope has been that you just don't feel inspired. You feel equipped. You feel like you have all these resources now that it becomes easier for you to make that first initial step. And that I hope that you take that step and you share it with others and it becomes a domino effect, Because I thank you to every guest who trusted me with their story, to any organization who's trusted me to share their message, to every person, every listener, every person who's ever clicked the link to this podcast, who's chosen me as their proprietor of information. I am super thankful, and I will not take your trust for granted. I tell you that much. Because this community is not small, it's growing, strengthening, and the work is far from over. Next week, we will launch our viewer episode where I will share reflections directly from you, your stories, what presence to power has meant in real life. Stay tuned. But before we part, I must say this. Protest is how we raise demands. Policy is how we make those demands stick. Your voice matters. Today, tomorrow, yesterday, your voice has always mattered. You're not far behind. You're not unqualified. You're more than qualified because you're experiencing it firsthand. So I say that to say, keep marching, keep meeting, keep engaging because the movement continues and you're a part of it. Now, with that being said, my name is Reggie Holloway, and this is Outreach with Reggie. Thank you for showing up, for listening, and for believing that presence leads to power. Until next time, keep making a difference from the streets to the systems. Keep showing up. Take care.